Sometimes the loneliest people find each other in the most unexpected ways. In a world that tells us we're not enough, too old, too broken, too different, two forgotten souls are about to prove that love doesn't always look like the fairy tale he's in. The winter of 1874. Bertha Hutchins drove her mule cart up a frozen mountain trail to Isaiah Fletcher's cabin. She was a woman the world had written off as too big and too bold. He was a Civil War veteran hiding from a life that had taken everything from him. What she offered that snowy evening would have shocked decent folks, but sometimes survival requires throwing away the rulebook. She needed food and shelter. He needed purpose and companionship. Their arrangement was simple, practical, and completely scandalous. But what happens when a deal made out of desperation becomes something neither of them expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains of Colorado Territory held their secrets close, and none closer than the man who lived in the log cabin perched on a ridge 8,000 feet above the world. Isaiah Fletcher had chosen this place for its silence, the kind of deep, bone-settling quiet that only came when civilization was a 3-day ride down. Treacherous paths that most sensible folks wouldn't attempt even in good weather. His cabin sat like a brown scar against the white expanse of early winter. Smoke rising steady from the stone chimney he built with his own hands. Inside, the rooms were sparse but solid. A table hewn from pine. 2 chairs, though he'd never needed the second one. Shelves lined with books he'd read until the pages went soft with handling. Shakespeare, Whitman, the Bible his mother had, pressed into his hands before he left for the war. Everything useful, nothing ornamental, except for the wooden figures he carved by lamplight when the long nights pressed too hard against his thoughts. The tin box under his bed held his military discharge papers, folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear the parchment clean through. Honorable discharge, they said. 3 years of service in the Union Army, 2 wounds that healed crooked, and a recommendation for conduct befitting a soldier of the Republic. What they didn't say was how he'd come home to find his wife remarried to his business partner, his house sold, and his name spoken in the past tense by folks who'd known him since childhood. So he'd taken his horse, his rifle, and what remained of his savings, and headed west until the mountains swallowed him whole. That was 1871. 3 years of learning to live with only his own voice for company. 3 years of discovering that a man could survive on very little if he set his mind to it. Game was plentiful if you knew where to look. The stream that ran past his door never froze completely, even in the hardest winters. His vegetable garden, terraced into the hillside, produced enough to see him through the cold months when fresh food became a distant memory. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, or told himself he had. The silence no longer made him restless. He could go weeks without speaking aloud, communicating only with the occasional elk that wandered too close or the pair of ravens that nested in the tall pine behind his cabin. They seemed to understand him well enough, tilting their black heads when he shared his morning coffee and the day's plans with them. But comfort and contentment weren't the same thing, though Isaiah had spent 3 years trying to convince himself otherwise. There were nights when the wind howled through the peaks, and the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a tomb. Nights when he'd catch himself setting 2 places at his small table before remembering he had no one to feed but himself. Nights when he'd wake from dreams of conversation and laughter, only to find the empty cabin mocking his loneliness. Still, he'd made peace with it. A man learned to live with what he had, and what Isaiah Fletcher had was silence, solitude, and the strange comfort of being forgotten by a world that had already forgotten him. That's what made the sound so startling, the creak and jangle of wheels on the frozen ground outside his cabin. Isaiah set down his whittling knife and moved to the window, peering through the thick glass he'd hauled up to mountain piece by precious piece. What he saw made him question whether the isolation had finally addled his brain. A mule cart was climbing the last steep stretch to his door, loaded high with wooden crates and burlap sacks. But it wasn't the cart that made him stare. It was the woman driving it. Large in every dimension, wrapped in a heavy wool coat that had seen better years, with graying brown hair pinned back in a practical bun. She handled the reins with the easy competence of someone who'd been driving difficult roads for most of her life. Bertha Hutchins had been traveling for 6 days, following directions from a trapper she'd met in Georgetown who claimed to know where the hermit lived. She'd paid him $2 silver for the information and another $1 for his promise not to mention the transaction to anyone else. Privacy, she'd learned, was worth paying for. The woman driving that cart had her own reasons for seeking out the edges of civilization. Bertha had been married once to a kind man named William who loved her exactly as she was, all 240 pounds of her. Every practical word that came out of her mouth, every moment when she chose directness over delicacy. William had been a shopkeeper in Denver, steady and reliable, until a heart attack took him on a Tuesday morning in 1872, leaving Bertha with debts, creditors, and the slow realization that William's affection had been the only thing standing between her and a world that had very definite ideas about what women should look like and how they should behave. The good ladies of Denver had made their feelings clear with meaningful glances and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Too large, too outspoken, too comfortable with herself in a way that made other women uncomfortable. After William's funeral, the whispers had grown louder. A woman like that, living alone. Unseemly, improper. The landlord had found reasons to raise her rent. The shopkeepers had found reasons to question her credit. Even the church, where she'd sung in the choir for 12 years, had suddenly discovered that her voice no longer suited their musical arrangements. So she'd sold what little remained of William's shop, loaded her possessions and her dozen chickens into the cart that had once delivered dry goods around Denver, and set out to find someplace where being different wasn't a crime. The trapper had mentioned that the hermit was a decent man, if odd, and that he lived so far from civilization that he probably wouldn't care what anyone looked like, as long as they could work and weren't inclined to gossip. That sounded like paradise to Bertha Hutchins. She pulled the cart to a stop 20 feet from the cabin's front door and sat for a moment, studying the place that might become her home. It was smaller than she'd hoped, but larger than she'd expected. 2 rooms, by the look of it, with a proper chimney and windows that still held glass. The man who stepped onto the covered porch was lean and weathered, with dark hair gone gray, at the temples and eyes that held the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust unexpected visitors. They studied each other across the distance. 2 people who'd been shaped by disappointment and rejection. 2 people who'd learned that survival sometimes required stepping outside the bounds of what decent folks considered proper. Isaiah Fletcher, 42 years old, alone for 3 years, wondering if the loneliness had finally driven him to hallucinations. Bertha Hutchins, 38 years old, widowed for 2 years, carrying everything she owned and a proposition that would have scandalized every proper woman in Colorado Territory. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The wind whistled through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out against the gray winter sky. Finally, Bertha climbed down from the cart with the careful dignity of a woman who'd learned to navigate the world despite its judgment, walked to within 10 feet of the porch, and spoke the words that would change both their lives forever. "Mr. Fletcher, I presume. I'm Bertha Hutchins, and I've got a proposition for you that you're going to want to hear." Isaiah Fletcher had imagined many things during his 3 years of solitude, but never this. A woman standing in his dooryard, snow beginning to fall around her shoulders, speaking to him as if they'd known each other for years instead of seconds. "Mrs. Hutchins," he said carefully, his voice rusty from disuse. "I'm not sure what you've heard about me, but I don't receive visitors. This isn't a place for women?" Bertha interrupted, her tone matter-of-fact rather than offended. "I can see that. What I'm wondering is whether it's a place for practical arrangements between practical people." The wind picked up, sending snow swirling between them, and Isaiah found himself stepping back toward his door without quite meaning to. Something in her directness unsettled him, not because it was rude, but because it was honest in a way he'd forgotten people could be. "What kind of arrangement?" he asked, though part of him already suspected this conversation would end with him barricading his door and her driving back down the mountain. Bertha glanced at the sky, where the clouds were settling in with the particular heaviness that promised a long snowfall, the kind that keeps us both alive through the winter. "May I come inside?" This isn't the sort of discussion that ought to be held in a blizzard. Isaiah hesitated. He hadn't had another person inside his cabin since the day he'd finished building it. The space was his sanctuary, his retreat from a world that had proven itself untrustworthy. But the snow was falling harder now, and whatever else this woman might be, she was human, and humans died in Colorado mountain storms. 5 minutes, he said, stepping aside. Bertha climbed the 3 wooden steps to his porch, her movements economical and sure. Up close, Isaiah could see that her face was lined but not hard, that her brown eyes held intelligence and something else, a wariness that matched his own. She'd been hurt, he realized. Maybe not in the same ways he had, but hurt nonetheless. Inside his cabin, she looked around with the assessing gaze of someone who understood the practicalities of keeping house. Her eyes took in the neat stack of firewood, the well-organized kitchen area, the books lined carefully on their shelves. He saw her notice the second chair at his table, and the way his eyes followed hers to it. "You live well for a hermit," she said, removing her heavy coat and hanging it on a peg by the door, as if she'd done it 100 times before. "Clean, organized, plenty of wood for the fire. You take care of yourself. I manage. I can see that. What I'm curious about is whether you ever get lonely enough to consider an alternative arrangement." Isaiah poured coffee from the pot that stayed warm on his stove, more to give his hand something to do than out of hospitality. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Hutchins?" "Bertha, and I'm proposing something that will sound improper to folks who've never been desperate." She accepted the coffee cup and wrapped her large hands around it. "I need food and shelter through the winter. I've got a dozen laying hens in that card, along with everything I own in the world, which isn't much but includes the ability to cook, clean, mend, and manage a household properly. And in exchange, you need sons." The words hung in the air, between them like smoke from a gunshot. Isaiah's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind beginning to howl around the cabin's walls. "I beg your pardon?" Bertha's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "You're a good man, from what I've been told. Decent, hard-working, but alone up here in a way that isn't natural for anyone. You're what, 40? 45? Old enough to know that time doesn't wait for anyone, and young enough that there's still time to build something lasting." Isaiah set down his cup with deliberate care. "Mrs. Hutchins, Bertha, and I'm 38, widowed 2 years, and still capable of bearing children. I'm not asking for love or romance or any of the pretty lies people tell each other. I'm talking about a practical arrangement. You need someone to keep your house, cook your meals, and give you sons to carry on your name. I need someone to keep me fed and sheltered and treat me with the basic respect that seems to be in short supply down in civilization." The bluntness of it should have shocked him. 3 years ago, it would have. But 3 years of solitude had stripped away many of Isaiah's illusions about how life was supposed to work. What she was proposing wasn't so different from the marriages he'd seen growing up, arrangements between families, Partnerships based on practical need rather than romantic fantasy. You're talking about marriage, he said. I'm talking about survival. Marriage is a word preachers use to make survival sound holy. She sipped her coffee and studied him over the rim of the cup. Though if it makes you more comfortable to think of it that way, I have no objections. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the first real snow of the season began to coat the windows. Isaiah found himself thinking of the long winter nights. Ahead, the silence that sometimes felt like a living thing pressing against his chest. He thought of his empty bed, his solitary meals, his conversations with ravens. What makes you think I'd be interested in such an arrangement? Because you haven't thrown me out yet, Bertha said simply. Because you've been alone up here for 3 years, and loneliness is written all over this place. 2 chairs at a table set for 1. Books read so many times, the pages are falling out. Enough wood carved into little figures to populate a small town. She gestured toward the shelf where his whittled animals stood in neat rows. You're a man who needs people, Mr. Fletcher. You've just convinced yourself you don't deserve them. The accuracy of her observation hit him like cold water. He turned away from her, looking out at the falling snow. You don't know anything about me. I know you're decent enough to let a strange woman into your home during a snowstorm. I know you're skilled enough to survive 3 years in the mountains alone, which means you're competent and resourceful. I know you read poetry and carve beautiful things and keep your home cleaner than most women I've met. She paused. And I know you're lonely because I recognize it. Takes one to know one. Isaiah was quiet for a long moment, watching the snow pile against his window. When he finally turned back to her, something in his expression had shifted. What happened to your husband? Art gave out on him. One moment he was laughing at something I'd said. The next, he was gone. Her voice softened just slightly. He was a good man. Kind to me when the rest of the world wasn't. After he died, I learned how much his kindness had been protecting me from. And you think I could protect you? I think we could protect each other. She set down her coffee cup and stood, reaching for her coat. But I can see this makes you uncomfortable. I'll find somewhere else to weather the storm. Wait. The word came out before Isaiah had consciously decided to speak it. Bertha paused, her hand on her coat. The storm's getting worse. You can't travel in this. I've managed worse. Stay the night, he heard himself say. We'll talk more in the morning when the weather clears. Bertha studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but I'll need to see to my mule and chickens first. They'll freeze if they're not sheltered properly. There's a lean-to behind the cabin. It's not much, but it's dry. Thank you. She pulled on her coat. And Mr. Fletcher? What I'm offering isn't charity. I'd be getting as much out of this arrangement as you would. Don't agree to anything out of pity. She headed for the door, leaving Isaiah alone with his thoughts and the sound of wind rattling his windows. Outside, he could hear her moving around, taking care of her animals with the same practical efficiency she'd shown in everything else. For the first time in 3 years, Isaiah Fletcher was not alone in his cabin. And for the first time since he'd fled to the mountains, he found himself wondering if solitude was really what he wanted after all. Isaiah woke to the smell of bacon cooking, and for a moment, he lay still in his narrow bed, wondering if he was dreaming. The scent was so foreign to his usual morning of black coffee and day-old bread that it seemed to belong to someone else's life entirely. Then he heard the soft clatter of dishes and remembered. Bertha Hutchins was in his kitchen, making herself at home as if she belonged there. He dressed quickly, running his fingers through his hair and trying to prepare himself for what promised to be the most awkward conversation of his life. In the clear light of morning, her proposition seemed even more outrageous than it had the night before. Decent people didn't arrange their lives with the frankness she'd displayed. Decent people courted properly, married in churches, built relationships on foundations of mutual affection and shared faith. But then again, Isaiah reflected as he pulled on his boots. He'd stopped being decent people's concern the day he'd fled to the mountains. When he emerged from his small bedroom, Bertha was standing at his stove, her graying hair pinned up neatly, wearing a clean brown dress that showed she'd taken the time to unpack at least some of her belongings. She'd found his plates, located his cutlery, and somehow transformed his sparse kitchen into something that looked almost domestic. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind that I started breakfast. I'm an early riser by nature, and sitting idle makes me restless." "I don't mind," Isaiah said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. The sight of another person moving comfortably through his space stirred feelings. He couldn't quite name gratitude mixed with resentment, pleasure touched by fear. She'd set the table for two, and Isaiah found himself staring at his second chair, which had sat empty for so long he'd begun to think of it as decorative rather than functional. Bertha noticed his gaze and smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "When was the last time you used both chairs?" "I don't remember," he admitted. "Then it's past time." She carried 2 plates to the table, each loaded with bacon, eggs, and what appeared to be fresh biscuits. "I brought flour and preserves in my cart, along with a few other staples. Figured if I was going to make this proposition, I should at least prove I could cook." Isaiah sat down carefully, as if the chair might not hold his weight after all these months of disuse. The food was excellent, better than anything he'd eaten since leaving Denver 3 years ago. Bertha had a light hand with seasoning and understanding of how to make simple ingredients sing. "This is very good," he said. "Thank you. Cooking was always something I enjoyed, though I didn't get to do much of it in my last years in Denver. Hard to cook properly when you're not sure if you can afford the ingredients." She cut into her biscuit with precise movements. "That's one thing about your proposition that appeals to me, the idea of having enough food to cook with again." "About that proposition? Sleep on it poorly?" Isaiah paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "I beg your pardon? Did you sleep poorly? Most people do when they're wrestling with a difficult decision. You have the look of a man who spent more time staring at the ceiling than resting." She was right, though Isaiah didn't particularly appreciate her ability to read him so easily. He'd lain awake for hours, staring into the darkness and trying to make sense of what she was offering. On the practical level, it made perfect sense, too. People with complementary needs finding a way to meet them. But on every other level, it felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "I'm not sure I'm the marrying kind," he said finally. "Neither am I, particularly. But I am the surviving kind, and so are you, or you wouldn't have lasted 3 years up here." She ate methodically, giving each bite proper attention. "The question isn't whether we're suited for marriage in some romantic sense. The question is whether we're suited for partnership. What's the difference? Marriage, the way most people practice it, is about feelings and expectations and all sorts of promises that sound pretty, but don't hold up when life gets difficult. Partnership is about recognizing what each person brings to the arrangement and respecting those contributions." She paused to sip her coffee. "I'm not asking you to love me, Mr. Fletcher. I'm asking you to work with me." Isaiah studied her face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas. What he saw instead was a woman who'd learned to be practical about life because the alternative was disappointment. There was something refreshing about her honesty, even if it made him uncomfortable. "And the question of children? If we're sharing a bed, children are a natural consequence. If they come, they'll be welcomed. If they don't," she shrugged, "we'll have each other's company and the satisfaction of building something worthwhile together." The matter-of-fact way she discussed such intimate subjects should have scandalized him. Instead, Isaiah found it oddly comforting. There were no games here, No coy hints or romantic pretenses. Just two adults discussing the practical realities of life. Outside, the storm that had blown in the previous evening was beginning to clear, though snow still fell steadily. Isaiah could see that several inches had accumulated overnight, enough to make travel treacherous for the next day or two. Whatever decision he made, Bertha would be staying at least that long. "What would you expect from me?" he asked. "Miss. Partnership. Respect. Fidelity. An honest day's work and an honest day's conversation. Protection from the sort of people who think a woman like me doesn't deserve basic human dignity." She met his eyes across the table. "What would you expect from me? The same, I suppose. Then we're starting from common ground." They finished their breakfast in companionable silence, and Isaiah found himself watching the way she moved, economical, efficient, but not hurried. She washed the dishes with the same attention she'd given to cooking, taking care with his few precious plates and cups. When she was finished, she hung the dish towel precisely where he'd always kept it, as if she'd been using his kitchen for years. "I should see to the animals," he said, reaching for his coat. "I'll come with you. I want to check on my chickens." They stepped out into the snowy morning together, and Isaiah was struck by how natural it felt to have another person beside him as he went about his daily chores. Bertha moved through the snow with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd grown up in hard country, and when they reached the lean-to where her mule and chickens had spent the night, she inspected everything with the critical eye of someone who understood that small problems could quickly become large ones if left unattended. Her chickens were fat and healthy, already pecking contentedly at the grain she scattered for them. The mule, a sturdy creature with intelligent eyes, nuzzled her shoulder as she checked his hooves for ice. "Good animals," Isaiah observed. "They've been good to me. The chickens especially fresh eggs every day, even through the worst of last winter." She stroked the mule's neck affectionately. "This is Chester. He's stubborn and opinionated, but he's never failed to get me where I needed to go." Isaiah found himself smiling at the obvious affection in her voice. "Whatever else, Bertha Hutchins might be, she was someone who took care of the creatures that depended on her." That spoke well of her character. As they walked back toward the cabin, Isaiah realized that for the first time in months, he wasn't dreading the day ahead. There would be conversation at meals, company during the long evening hours, someone to share the small observations and thoughts that had been accumulating in his mind like dust on unused furniture. It wasn't love, but it might be something better. Companionship based on mutual respect and genuine need. The question was whether he had the courage to accept what she was offering. The snowstorm lasted 3 days, trapping them together in the small cabin while the world outside disappeared behind curtains of white. By the second morning, Isaiah had begun to understand what Bertha meant about partnership. She moved through his space with respect, but without deference, finding ways to improve their daily routines without making him feel displaced in his own home. She'd discovered his recipe collection, a small notebook where he'd written down the few dishes he'd learned to prepare adequately, and had begun experimenting with variations that made their simple ingredients stretch further and taste better. The cabin filled with aromas that transformed the space. Bread rising by the fire, herbs she'd brought from Denver steaming in hot water, the rich smell of soup that seemed to improve with each day it simmered. "You've been starving yourself," she observed on the third morning, watching him eat with obvious pleasure a breakfast of eggs scrambled with wild onions and herbs. Not of food necessarily, but of the small pleasures that make food worth eating. Isaiah paused, considering her words. "I never saw much point in making elaborate meals for one person. That's where you're wrong." Bertha refilled his coffee cup with the same careful attention she gave to everything else. Taking care of yourself properly isn't about other people. It's about recognizing that you're worth the effort. A man who lets himself live on bread and coffee for 3 years is a man who's forgotten his own value. The observation stung because it was accurate. Isaiah had fallen into habits of bare survival, doing only what was necessary to keep himself alive and functional. He told himself it was practical, efficient, but Bertha's presence had shown him the difference between existing and living. "You speak from experience," he said. "I do. After William died, I went through a period where I couldn't see the point of cooking for myself either. Ate crackers and cheese for weeks, sometimes not even that. Finally realized that if I was going to survive what the world had in store for me, I needed to start by treating myself the way I wanted others to treat me." She was kneading dough as she spoke, her capable hands working the mixture with practiced rhythm. Isaiah found himself watching the process with fascination. Not just the skill she displayed, but the care she took with even this simple task. "Is that what brought you up here?" he asked. "The realization that you needed to take care of yourself?" "Partly. But also the understanding that I couldn't do it alone forever." She shaped the dough into a neat loaf and set it aside to rise. "People aren't meant to live in complete isolation, Mr. Fletcher. We're social creatures, even the most independent of us. The question is whether we find healthy ways to connect with others or unhealthy ones." "And you think this arrangement would be healthy?" "I think it would be honest, which is more than most people manage in their relationships." She wiped her hands clean and joined him at the table. "We'd be choosing each other with our eyes open, for practical reasons that make sense to both of us. No illusions, no unrealistic expectations, no pretending to be something we're not to win someone's approval." Over the 3 days of enforced proximity, Isaiah had begun to see what she meant. Bertha had made no effort to present herself as anything other than what she was: a large woman with strong opinions, practical skills, and a directness that could be startling. She didn't simper or flatter or try to make herself smaller to accommodate his comfort. Instead, she simply was competent, thoughtful, occasionally funny in a dry way that caught him off guard. For his part, he found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't expected. The constant vigilance that had become second nature during his years of solitude began to ease. He didn't have to weigh every word or worry about revealing too much of himself, because Bertha seemed genuinely uninterested in judging him. On the second evening, she'd noticed his collection of carved figures and asked about them with real curiosity rather than polite interest. When he'd shown her his work small, animals whittled from scraps of pine and oak during the long winter nights, she'd examined each piece with attention. "You have real skill," she'd said, turning a carved owl over in her hands. "These aren't just time killers. They're art. They're just whittling." "No, they're not." Her voice had been firm but not argumentative. "You put thought into these, and feeling. Look at the way you've captured the expression in this owl's eyes, or the texture of this rabbit's fur. That's not accident, that's talent." Isaiah had felt heat rise in his cheeks at the praise. It had been so long since anyone had looked at his work with appreciation that he'd almost forgotten why he did it. Talking with Bertha about the challenge of capturing an animal's essence in wood, about the satisfaction of finding the form hidden inside each piece of timber, had reminded him of pleasures he'd set aside along with everything else from his former life. "Do you have any artistic inclinations?" he'd asked. "I embroider," she'd admitted, almost shyly. "Nothing fancy, just practical things. Dishcloths, pillowcases, the occasional wall hanging. But I like the way the colors work together, the patterns emerging from simple stitches." She'd shown him some of her work the next day, pulling samples from her carefully packed belongings. Her embroidery was indeed simple, but executed with the same attention to quality that she brought to everything else. Isaiah had found himself studying the neat stitches, the subtle variations in color that created depth and interest in seemingly basic designs. "You could teach me," he'd said, surprising himself. "You'd want to learn?" "I'd want to learn something you valued." The conversation had created a new warmth between them. Not romantic exactly, but something deeper than mere politeness. They were beginning to see each other as individuals with inner lives worth exploring, rather than simply potential solutions to practical problems. By the third morning, when the storm finally began to clear, Isaiah realized he was dreading her departure. The cabin would feel impossibly empty after 3 days of shared meals, conversation, and companionable silence. The idea of returning to his solitary routine of eating alone, sleeping alone, spending the long evening hours with only his books for company seemed less like peaceful solitude, but more like self-imposed exile. "The weather's clearing," Bertha observed, standing at the window where gray sky was beginning to show between the clouds. "Yes, I could leave today, if that's what you prefer. The roads will be difficult, but not impossible." Isaiah joined her at the window, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender soap she used. Outside, the world looked transformed by snow cleaner, more beautiful, but also more isolated than ever. "What if you stayed?" he heard himself ask. "For how long?" "For as long as it works for both of us." Bertha turned to face him, her brown eyes serious. "Are you accepting my proposition, Mr. Fletcher?" "I'm accepting your partnership, Mrs. Hutchins, and I think—" He paused, searching for words that would capture what he was feeling. "I think we might be good for each other." For the first time since she'd arrived, Bertha smiled without reservation. "I think so, too." Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, but neither of them was thinking about the weather anymore. They were thinking about the future they might build together. Not perfect, perhaps, but honest and practical and based on something more solid than romantic fantasy. They were thinking about home. The first month of their arrangement settled into rhythms that surprised Isaiah with their naturalness. Bertha had moved her belongings from the mule cart into the cabin's main room, hanging her dresses alongside his shirts, arranging her few books beside his extensive collection, placing her embroidery basket near the window where the light was best for close work. She'd taken over the larger bedroom without discussion, leaving him the smaller space that had always been his. And somehow this felt right generous without being presumptuous. Their days began with shared breakfast and coffee, planned together. The night before, Bertha would see to the chickens and prepare the morning meal, while Isaiah checked on the animals and split wood for the day. They'd eat together, discussing the weather, the needs of the homestead, small observations about the world outside their windows. Then they'd separate for the morning work, Bertha managing the household tasks that had been neglected during Isaiah's bachelor years, while he tended to repairs and improvements that were easier to accomplish with someone else to hold boards or fetch tools. It was during one of these morning work sessions that Bertha discovered Isaiah's whittling knife and the small pile of wood shavings in the corner where he did his carving. She'd been sweeping when she found the knife, examining it with the careful attention she gave to all tools. "This is beautifully balanced," she said, testing the weight of it in her hand. "Did you make it yourself?" "The handle, yes. The blade came from an old kitchen knife that broke. I reshaped it and fitted it to new wood." Isaiah felt oddly self-conscious about her interest in his tools. "It's nothing special. It's perfect for detailed work. The grip fits your hand exactly. I can tell from the wear patterns." She handed it back to him with care. "May I watch? You work sometime? I've never seen wood carving done properly." That evening, after their dinner dishes were cleaned and put away, Isaiah found himself setting up his carving area by the firelight while Bertha brought her embroidery to the chair across from him. The domesticity of the scene, two people engaged in quiet, creative work while the wind whistled outside, struck him as something from a life he'd never dared imagine for himself. "What are you making?" she asked, settling into her chair with a partially completed pillowcase covered in delicate blue flowers. I'm not sure yet. Sometimes I start with an idea. Sometimes I let the wood tell me what it wants to become. He selected a piece of oak from his small pile, running his fingers over its surface. This piece feels like it might have a bird hidden in it. How can you tell? Isaiah turned the wood in his hands, considering. The grain, mostly. The way it flows. See here. He showed her the subtle lines running through the timber. These could become wing feathers if I'm careful with them. Bertha leaned forward, genuinely interested. It's like reading, isn't it? Understanding a language most people don't notice. That's exactly right. Isaiah was surprised by how well she understood. Wood has its own logic, its own preferences. You can force it to become something it doesn't want to be, but the result is never as good as when you work with its natural inclinations. People are like that too, Bertha observed, returning to her embroidery. Most folks spend so much time trying to force themselves into shapes that don't suit them that they forget to discover what they're naturally good at. As Isaiah began the careful work of roughing out his bird's basic shape, he found himself thinking about her words. Had he been forcing himself into the shape of a hermit all these years, or had solitude truly been his natural inclination? The question felt more complicated now that he had Bertha's presence to compare against his former isolation. Is this what you're naturally good at? He asked, nodding toward her embroidery. Part of it. I'm good at making things beautiful and functional at the same time. Good at seeing what needs doing and figuring out how to do it efficiently. She held up the pillowcase to check her progress. But what I'm best at, I think, is recognizing quality in other people and helping them recognize it in themselves. The comment felt pointed, though not unkindly so. Isaiah had spent 3 years telling himself he was better off alone, that he had nothing worthwhile to offer another person. Bertha's presence, her obvious appreciation for his skills, her respect for his intelligence, her comfort with his company, was challenging that narrative in ways that felt both welcome and uncomfortable. You think I've been hiding from something, he said. I think you've been protecting yourself from something. There's a difference. Her needle moved in steady, practiced strokes. But protection that goes on too long becomes its own kind of prison. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the whisper of Isaiah's blade against wood and the soft rustle of Bertha's thread. Outside, an owl called from the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the lonely howl of a coyote. Tell me about your husband, Isaiah said eventually. Bertha's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their rhythm. William was a gentleman. Quiet, thoughtful, never tried to make me into something I wasn't. He liked my directness, said it was refreshing after a lifetime of people who never said what they really meant. Her voice softened with memory. He made me feel valuable just as I was. That's a rare gift. Do you miss him? Every day. But not in the way that makes me want to stop living. In the way that makes me grateful I knew what real partnership looked like. She glanced up from her embroidery. What about you? Was there someone before you came to the mountains? Isaiah's hands stilled on his carving. He'd known this question would come eventually, but he still wasn't prepared for the way it made his chest tighten. There was my wife, Ellen, though by the time I left for the war, I'm not sure we were much of a partnership anymore. What happened? I came home to find her married to my business partner. They'd been courting while I was fighting at Antietam and Chancellorsville, making plans for a life that didn't include me. The old bitterness crept into his voice, despite his efforts to keep it neutral. She said she'd thought I was dead. Said she couldn't wait forever for a man who might never return. That must have been devastating. It was. Not just a betrayal, but the realization that our marriage had been so fragile she could replace me without much difficulty. Isaiah set down his knife and looked into the fire. Made me question whether I'd ever really known her at all, or if I'd just been in love with my own imagination of who she was. Bertha was quiet for a long moment, her needle moving thoughtfully through the fabric. Some people can only love others when it's convenient for them, she said finally. That's not a reflection on your worth, it's a reflection on their capacity. How can you be sure? Because you've spent 3 years taking care of yourself and your homestead with the same attention to detail I see in your carving. Because you let a strange woman into your home during a blizzard and treated her with respect, even when her proposition shocked you. Because you're sitting here now, sharing your evening and your thoughts with someone who might not deserve either. She looked up and met his eyes. A man with nothing to offer doesn't inspire that kind of trust. Isaiah felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. For 3 years, he'd carried Helen's abandonment as evidence of his inadequacy. Bertha's matter-of-fact assessment of his character based not on romantic idealization, but on observed behavior, offered a different perspective entirely. You see me more clearly than I see myself, he said. Sometimes it takes an outside eye. I spent years letting other people's opinions convince me I wasn't worth much either. Took William's love to show me they were wrong, and even then, I didn't fully believe it until I had to survive without him. She returned to her embroidery with renewed focus. The difference between us is that you retreated when you were hurt. I fought back. Neither approach is wrong, but both can be taken too far. Isaiah picked up his carving again, finding that his hands were steadier now. The bird was beginning to emerge from the wood, not the delicate songbird he'd originally envisioned, but something stronger. A hawk, perhaps, or an eagle. Something that knew how to soar above the storm's thud. As the evening wore on and their quiet conversation continued, Isaiah began to understand that what was happening between them was different from anything he'd experienced before. Not the passionate intensity of youth or the desperate need of loneliness, but something more solid, a recognition of mutual worth, a willingness to build something together based on who they actually were rather than who they wished they could. It felt like the beginning of something that could last. February brought the hardest cold Isaiah had experienced in his 3 years on the mountain. The thermometer he kept nailed to the cabin's north wall dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for days at a time. The stream that provided their water froze solid for the first time in his memory, forcing them to melt snow for drinking and washing. Even with the fire burning constantly, ice formed on the inside of the windows each morning, creating crystalline patterns that caught the weak sunlight like stained glass. But instead of the grim endurance that had characterized his previous winters alone, Isaiah found himself oddly content. The enforced intimacy of sharing small spaces during the coldest weather had deepened his and Bertha's understanding of each other in ways that surprised them both. They'd learned to move around each other without collision, to share tasks without discussion, to offer comfort and companionship in the small gestures that made survival bearable. It was during one of these bitter February nights that Isaiah discovered Bertha's secret project. Unable to sleep because of the wind howling through the peaks like a living thing, he'd risen to add wood to the fire and found her sitting at the table, working by candlelight on something she quickly covered when she heard him moving. Couldn't sleep either? He asked, settling beside her with a cup of warmed milk. The wind gets into my dreams sometimes, she admitted. Makes me restless. Isaiah nodded. He understood. The isolation that felt peaceful during gentler weather could become oppressive when the storms raged for days without break. What are you working on? Bertha hesitated, then slowly pulled back the cloth covering her project. What Isaiah saw made his breath catch. It was a baby's blanket, worked in soft wool dyed pale yellow and white, with intricate patterns that spoke of hours of careful labor. I know we haven't. That is, nothing has happened yet between us that way, she said, a usually confident voice uncertain. But I thought, if we're truly going to be partners, if we're truly going to build a life together, then perhaps. She stopped, her cheeks flushing in the candlelight. Isaiah reached out to touch the blanket's edge, marveling at the fineness of her stitches. "It's beautiful, Bertha. The most beautiful thing I've ever seen. You don't think it's presumptuous?" "I think it's hopeful, and hope is something I'd forgotten how to have." They sat together in the flickering candlelight, the baby blanket spread between them like a promise. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the cabin walls, but inside, something warm and fragile had begun to grow. "I've been thinking," Isaiah said carefully, "about our arrangement, about what it means and where it might lead. And I think I've been approaching it wrong, thinking of it as something practical and temporary, when perhaps it's something else entirely." Bertha folded the blanket with careful precision, but her eyes remained on his face. "What do you think it is? A chance at something real, a genuine partnership between two people who chose each other for honest reasons." Isaiah paused, searching for words that would capture what he was feeling. "I've been sharing my home with you for 2 months now, and I can't imagine going back to the way things were before. Not just because you cook well or keep house efficiently, but because—" He stopped, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was trying to say. "Because I see you," Bertha finished softly. "Because I know who you are and value it. Yes, and because I see you too. Not just a woman who needed shelter, but someone remarkable. Someone who deserves better than a business arrangement disguised as a marriage." The wind rattled the windows, sending shadows dancing across the small room. In that wavering light, they looked at each other with new understanding. "What are you proposing, Isaiah?" It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice made something flutter in his chest. "I'm proposing that we stop pretending this is just about survival and acknowledge what it's become." He reached across the table to take her hand, marveling at how right it felt to touch her. "I'm proposing that we build something together, not out of desperation, but out of choice." Bertha's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Are you saying you care for me?" "I'm saying I've come to love you, Bertha Hutchins. Not the desperate love of a lonely man grabbing at companionship, but the steady love of someone who's discovered what real partnership means." She was quiet for so long that Isaiah began to fear he'd misread the situation entirely. Then she squeezed his hand, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I love you too, Isaiah Fletcher. For weeks now, though I was afraid to admit. Afraid it would complicate our practical arrangement with messy feelings and unrealistic expectations. And now? Now I think the feelings were there all along, underneath the practical parts. We just needed time to trust them." She brought his hand to her lips and kissed his knuckles gently. "So what do we do now?" "Now we stop sleeping in separate rooms and start building the life we both want." That night, for the first time since Bertha's arrival, they shared Isaiah's narrow bed. Not out of passion or desperation, but out of love acknowledged and freely given. They held each other against the cold while the wind howled outside. Two people who'd found something precious in the most unlikely circumstances. In the days that followed, their relationship shifted in subtle but profound ways. The courtesy that had characterized their interactions gave way to genuine intimacy. They touched more freely, hands brushing as they worked, shoulders bumping companionably as they cooked together, brief kisses exchanged in passing. Their conversations deepened, moving beyond practical concerns to dreams and fears and the small revelations that true partners share. Isaiah began work on a proper cradle, carving it from seasoned oak with the same attention to detail he brought to his smaller figures. He worked on it in the evenings while Bertha sewed baby clothes, both of them planning for a future that now seemed not just possible but inevitable. "Do you want sons or daughters?" Bertha asked one evening as she held up a tiny shirt for his inspection. "Healthy children who know they're loved," Isaiah replied without hesitation. "Everything else is just details. Even if they're daughters, who inherit their mother's size and opinions." Isaiah looked up from his carving to meet her eyes. "Especially then." The world needs more people who aren't afraid to speak the truth and take up space. By March, when the worst of the winter began to break, they'd settled into the rhythm of an established couple. Their partnership had evolved beyond practical arrangement into something deeper, a marriage of minds and hearts that felt as solid as the mountain stone beneath their cabin. But it was also during March that the letter arrived, brought by a trapper making his way down from the higher elevations. The letter that would test everything they built together and force them to decide how much their love was truly worth. The letter that would change their lives forever. The trapper who brought the letter was a grizzled man named Harris, who made the circuit between the mountain settlements twice a year, carrying news, mail, and small supplies to those hardy souls who chose to live beyond civilization's reach. Isaiah had met him once before, 2 years ago, and had specifically asked him not to mention Isaiah's whereabouts to anyone in the outside world. "Got a letter for you, Fletcher," Harris said, accepting the cup of coffee Bertha offered and settling himself by their fire with obvious relief. "Been carrying it since last fall, waiting for the passes to clear enough for travel." Isaiah stared at the envelope Harris pulled from his leather pouch. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the return address made his stomach clench. Thomas Fletcher, attorney at law, Denver, Colorado Territory. "Thomas Fletcher," Bertha said quietly, reading over his shoulder. "A relative? My brother." Isaiah's voice sounded strange to his own ears. "My younger brother." He held the letter without opening it, as if the paper itself might burn his fingers. Thomas had been barely 18 when Isaiah left for the war, a bookish boy more interested in law studies than the family business, content to let his older brother handle the practical concerns of their father's store while he buried himself in legal texts. Isaiah had been protective of Thomas in the way older brothers are, shielding him from the harsher realities of commerce and adult responsibility. "You going to open it or just stare at it?" Harris asked, draining his coffee cup. "Been curious about that letter for months now. Your brother was mighty insistent I find you and deliver it personal." Isaiah's hands shook slightly as he broke the wax seal. The letter was written in Thomas's careful script, but the confidence in the handwriting spoke of a man who'd grown up considerably since Isaiah had last seen him. "My dear brother Isaiah, I have been searching for you for over 2 years ever, since I learned of Helen's betrayal and your subsequent disappearance from Denver. I pray this letter finds you well, and that you will forgive my persistence in locating you. Much has changed since you left. Our father passed away 18 months ago peacefully in his sleep, though he never stopped hoping you would return. He left the business to both of us equally, but since your whereabouts were unknown, I have been managing everything in your absence. The store has prospered under expanded operations, and I have opened 2 additional locations in Colorado Springs and Pueblo. More importantly, I have recently learned information about Helen and Charles Morrison that you deserve to know. Helen's marriage to Morrison was not the love match she claimed. Morrison was already heavily in debt when he courted her, and their union was primarily motivated by his desire to access your half of the business through what he assumed would be your death in the war. When you returned alive, they panicked and fabricated the story of your presumed death to justify their hasty marriage. I have also discovered that Helen never received your letters from the battlefield. Morrison intercepted them and destroyed them, allowing her to believe you had forgotten her or found someone else. She genuinely believed you were either dead or had abandoned her when she agreed to marry Morrison. The truth is, brother, that you were betrayed not by a faithless wife, but by a scheming business partner who manipulated both you and Helen for financial gain. Helen learned of Morrison's deception only months after their marriage, but by then felt trapped by propriety and pregnancy. I tell you this not to reopen old wounds, but because you deserve to know the truth. Helen Morrison died in childbirth last spring. Morrison has since fled Denver under suspicion of embezzlement from other business partners. Justice of a sort has been served. Your share of our father's estate amounts to nearly $20,000, Isaiah. More importantly, you have family who loves you and longs for your return. I am married now myself to a wonderful woman named Catherine who would very much like to meet her brother-in-law. We have a daughter, your niece, who bears your eyes, and our father's stubborn chin. I know you have built a life wherever you are, and I respect your right to choose your own path. But please, at least write to let me know you are alive and well. The enclosed bank draft is yours. By right, use it as you see fit. But know that you always have a home and a place in the family business if you choose to return. Please come home, Isaiah. Or at least, let me come to you. There is so much lost. Time to recover. Your loving brother, Thomas Fletcher. Isaiah read the letter twice, then set it down with trembling hands. The silence in the cabin was profound, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Harris clearing his throat uncomfortably. Good news or bad? The trapper asked. I don't know, Isaiah whispered. Bertha picked up the letter with careful fingers, reading it quickly. When she finished, she folded it precisely and handed it back to Isaiah without comment. There's also this, Harris said, producing a bank draft from his pouch. Your brother said you'd need proof he wasn't just spinning tailies. The draft was made out to Isaiah Fletcher in the amount of $500, more money than he'd seen in one place since leaving Denver. The reality of it hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just a mountain hermit living on the edges of society. He was a man with family, with inheritance, with a place waiting for him in the civilized world. Everything he told himself about being forgotten and unwanted was suddenly dramatically untrue. I should head on, Harris said, sensing the tension in the room. Got 3 more stops before dark. He stood, shouldering his pack. Fletcher, if you want to send a reply, I'll be back through here in early fall. After Harris left, Isaiah and Bertha sat in silence, the letter lying on the table between them like an accusation. Outside, the March wind was gentle, carrying the scent of melting snow and the promise of spring, the spring that would make travel down the mountain not just possible but easy. $20,000, Bertha said finally. Yes, and family waiting for you. Yes, and a business that's apparently thriving without you. Isaiah looked at her, trying to read her expression. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Bertha said carefully, that everything has changed. 3 months ago, you were a hermit with nothing to offer anyone. Now you're a wealthy man with family and prospects and a brother who's begging you to come home. Nothing has changed about how I feel about you, hasn't it? Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Isaiah, you have a chance to reclaim the life you lost, to go back to civilization, to marry properly, to have the kind of wife who would fit into society instead of... Stop. Isaiah reached across the table to take her hands. Stop right there. Do you think I care about any of that? Do you think money or social standing matters more to me than what we've built here? It should. It would to most people. I'm not most people, and neither are you. That's why this works between us. Bertha pulled her hands free and stood, walking to the window where she could look out at the mountain peaks. Your brother is expecting you to return. Your family wants to reunite with you. You have obligations. I have obligations here too. To you. To the life we've planned together. Plans made by a man who thought he had nothing else. You're not that man anymore, Isaiah. The letter changes everything. It doesn't change how I feel about you, doesn't it? She turned to face him, and he saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he'd seen when she first arrived, when she believed she had nowhere else to go. Be honest with yourself. When you read that letter, when you realized you could go back to the world and take your rightful place in it, didn't some part of you feel relieved? Didn't you think about how much easier it would be to find a proper wife, someone suitable for a prosperous businessman? Isaiah started to deny it, then stopped, because there had been a moment, just a flash, when he'd imagined himself back in Denver, well-dressed and prosperous, courting some respectable widow who would never shock a dinner party with bold opinions or take up more than her allotted share of space. Thought the moment of silence was enough. Bertha saw the truth in his face. "I thought so," she said quietly. "Bertha, that was honesty. And I appreciate it, even if it hurts." She sat back down at the table, her hands folded in her lap with unnatural stillness. "Here's what I think, Isaiah. I think you should go back to Denver. I think you should reunite with your family and reclaim your inheritance and build the life you were meant to have." "And what about us? What about the life we were building here?" "We were building a life based on necessity. Now you have choices. Real choices. You should make them with your eyes open, not weighted down by obligations to a woman you took in during a snowstorm. You're not an obligation, aren't I?" Bertha's smile was sad but genuine. "Isaiah, I love you. I love what we've created together. But I won't be the reason you turn your back on family and fortune. I won't be the chain that keeps you from the life you deserve." The letter lay between them, suddenly seeming to pulse, with possibility and threat in equal measure. Outside, the spring wind continued to blow, carrying the scent of new growth and change. Everything had changed, just as Bertha said. The question was what they would do about it. The week following the letter's arrival passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. Isaiah and Bertha moved through their daily routines with careful politeness, both of them hyper-aware of the unspoken tension that had settled over there. Cabin-like morning fog. They spoke of practical things, the weather, the animals, the garden they'd planned for spring, planting, but avoided any mention of the future that had seemed so certain just days before. Isaiah found himself studying Bertha with new eyes, trying to imagine her in the drawing rooms of Denver society. She would be beautiful to him anywhere, he knew, but he couldn't deny that she would be judged harshly by people who valued conformity over character. At the same time, he tried to picture himself back in the world of commerce and social obligations, wearing fine clothes and attending dinner parties, and found the image strangely hollow. Bertha, for her part, had begun making quiet preparations. She mended her traveling dress with extra care, packed her few belongings into neat bundles, and spent long hours staring out the window at the snow-covered peaks as if memorizing them. She never spoke of leaving, but Isaiah could see it in every careful gesture. She was preparing to set him free. On the 5th day after Harris's visit, Isaiah woke to find Bertha already up and dressed, standing by the window with a cup of coffee. Her face was composed, but he'd learned to read the subtle signs of her moods. She was holding herself too carefully, like someone bracing for physical pain. "You're leaving today," he said. It wasn't a question. "The weather's clearing. The roads will be passable." She didn't turn from the window. "I thought I'd head down to Georgetown, maybe find work there until I can figure out what comes next." "Bertha, I've been thinking about what you said about obligations. You're right. You do have obligations here. But they're not to me, Isaiah. They're to yourself." She finally turned to face him, and he saw that she'd been crying. "You have a chance to make peace with your past, to reconnect with family, to build something meaningful with the gifts you've been given. I won't be the reason you don't take it." Isaiah felt something tear inside his chest. What if I don't want to take it? What if I want to stay here with you and build the life we planned? Then you'll always wonder what might have been. And someday, maybe not today or tomorrow, but someday, you'll resent me for it. That's not true, isn't it? Bertha moved away from the window to face him fully. "Isaiah, I've seen what happens when people sacrifice their opportunities for love. Sometimes it works, but more often it breeds resentment and regret. I won't risk our beautiful beginning becoming a bitter ending. So you're choosing for both of us. I'm choosing to love you enough to let you go." A voice broke slightly on the words, but she continued. "If what we have is real, if it's as strong as I believe it is, then it will survive your absence. And if it DOESN single quotes T dot dot double quotes," she shrugged with false lightness, "then better to find out now than after years of wondering." Isaiah wanted to argue, to demand that she stay, to insist that their love was more important than family obligations or social expectations. But something in her face stopped him. This wasn't the impulsive decision of a woman afraid of commitment. It was the carefully considered choice of someone who'd learned to think beyond her own immediate desires. "How long?" he asked. "How long what? How long should I be gone? If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to go back to Denver and face my past, how long do I have before you give up on me?" Bertha was quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "A year," she said finally. "Take a year to reconnect with your family, to understand what your life could be like if you stayed in civilization. If after a year you still want to come back to the mountains, to the life we were building, then I'll be waiting." "Where?" "Here. I'll take care of the cabin, the animals. Keep everything ready for your return." She managed a small smile. "Or your decision to sell it all and start fresh somewhere else. And if I don't come back, if I decide to stay in Denver." The pain that flashed across her face was quickly suppressed. "Then I'll know I was right to set you free. And I'll find a way to build a new life for myself." They stood facing each other, across the small cabin that had become their world. Two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances and were now preparing to test its strength against the pull of duty and obligation. "I don't want to leave you," Isaiah said quietly. "I know. That's what makes this so hard." Bertha stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, could see the golden flecks in her brown eyes. "But Isaiah, if you stay because you're afraid to face your past, or because you think you owe me something, then you're not really choosing me. You're just avoiding a difficult decision. I deserve better than that." "We both do." Isaiah reached up to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears she couldn't quite hold back. "I love you, Bertha Hutchins. I love you too, Isaiah Fletcher. More than I ever thought possible." She leaned into his touch. "That's why I can do this. That's why I can be strong enough to let you go find out who you really are when you have choices." That afternoon, Isaiah began his own preparations for departure. He packed his saddlebags with careful attention to what he might need in Denver: his best clothes, the bank draft from Thomas, the few personal items that had meaning for him. But the hardest decisions came when he reached for his whittling knife and the half-finished cradle he'd been carving. "Take the knife," Bertha said from behind him. "You'll want something to do with your hands when the city gets too noisy." "What? About the cradle? Leave it. If you come back, we'll finish it together. If you don single quotes T dot dot," she shrugged, "I'll finish it myself and give it to someone who needs it." They made love that night with desperate tenderness, holding each other as if they could somehow prevent the morning from coming through sheer force of will. They spoke in whispers of the future they'd imagined together, the children they'd hoped for, the improvements they'd planned for the homestead, the quiet contentment of growing old together in their mountain refuge. "Promise me something," Bertha said as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed. "Anything. Promise me you'll really try. Don't just go through the motions in Denver. Really open yourself to the possibility that you might want to stay. Get to know your family again. Consider what kind of life you could have there. Be honest about what you find. And promise me something in return." "What?" "Promise me you'll take care of yourself while I'm gone. Not just survive, but really live. Don't spend the whole year waiting for me to come back. Build something for yourself, whether I'm part of it or not. I promise." They held each other until dawn. Two people preparing to let go of the most precious thing they'd ever found in the hope that doing so would prove its worth. When morning came, Isaiah rose early to prepare for the journey down the mountain. The snow was melting in earnest now, creating streams that hadn't existed the week before, filling the air with the sound of running water and the promise of spring. It was the perfect time for new beginnings, he thought, even when they required painful endings. Bertha made him breakfast, eggs and bacon and fresh bread, enough food to sustain him on the first day of travel. They ate in companionable silence, both of them aware that this might be their last shared meal for a very long time. "I should go," Isaiah said finally, though he made no move to rise from the table. "Yes, you should. The longer I wait, the harder it gets. I know." He stood, shouldering his pack and reaching for his coat. At the door, he turned back to look at her, this remarkable woman who'd appeared in his life like an answered prayer and was now setting him free out of love. 1 year. He said, 1 year. All right, I'd like that. Isaiah opened the door, then paused. "Bertha, what we built here, it was real, wasn't it? The most real thing I've ever known." He nodded and stepped out into the morning air, not trusting himself to say goodbye. Behind him, the cabin door closed with quiet finality, and Isaiah Fletcher began the long journey back to the world he'd left behind. But as he loaded his horse and prepared to descend the mountain trail, he carried with him more than just his belongings. He carried the memory of Bertha's courage in letting him go, the knowledge of what real partnership looked like, and the hope that love strong enough to survive separation might also be strong enough to overcome the obstacles that waited in the world below. The year ahead would test everything they'd built together. By its end, they would both know whether what they'd found on the mountain was substantial enough to withstand the pull of family, duty, and all the complicated demands of life beyond their small cabin. As Isaiah rode away, he didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. But in his heart, he carried the promise of return and the hope that when the year was over, he would have earned the right to choose love over obligation, partnership over propriety, and the woman who'd seen his worth. When he'd forgotten it himself, the mountain watched him go, silent and eternal, keeping its own counsel about the choices that lay ahead. 11 months, 3 weeks, 4 days. Isaiah stood at the window of his brother's elegant Denver home, watching the busy street below and counting the time until his year away would be complete. His reflection in the glass showed a man transformed, clean-shaven, well-dressed, bearing the polished appearance of prosperity. But the eyes that stared back at him held the same restless longing that had plagued him since the day he'd ridden down from the mountain. Denver had welcomed the prodigal brother with open arms. Thomas, now a successful attorney with political aspirations, had embraced him with tears of joy and immediately set about reintegrating Isaiah into civilized society. There had been parties, introductions, business meetings, and countless opportunities to reclaim his place in the world he'd abandoned. The family business had indeed prospered in his absence. Thomas had expanded operations beyond their father's modest dry goods store into a network of suppliers, serving the mining camps and growing settlements throughout Colorado Territory. Isaiah's inheritance was real and substantial enough to set him up comfortably for life, with or without active participation in the business. Thomas's wife, Catherine, had been everything a sister-in-law should be: gracious, welcoming, genuinely pleased to finally meet the brother she'd heard so much about. Their daughter, little Margaret, had indeed inherited the Fletcher eyes and stubborn chin, and had quickly attached herself to her newfound uncle with the uncomplicated affection of childhood. There had been other introductions as well. Denver's eligible widows had been paraded before him with increasing frequency as the months passed. Refined ladies who played piano beautifully, spoke French, and would never dream of proposing practical arrangements for survival. Women who would fit seamlessly into his new life of social obligations and business dinners. And Isaiah had genuinely tried to feel something for them beyond polite appreciation. He'd courted Martha Whitmore, a banker's widow with impeccable manners and a substantial inheritance of her own. He'd escorted Eleanor Hartwell to the theater and found her conversation intelligent and her company pleasant. He'd even gone so far as to consider proposing to Sarah Benedict, a young widow whose gentle demeanor and obvious admiration for him had earned Thomas's enthusiastic approval. But each time he'd imagined himself married to one of these suitable women, the image felt hollow. They would give him respectability, social standing, perhaps even affection. What they couldn't give him was the frank partnership, the absolute honesty, the sense of being known and valued for exactly who he was that he'd found with Bertha. Now, with only weeks left in his promised year, Isaiah faced the decision he'd been avoiding since his first month back in Denver. He could stay, marry respectably, build the life everyone expected of him, or he could return to the mountains and the woman who'd had the courage to let him go. The saddlebags lay on his bed, packed and unpacked a dozen times over the past month. His horse was stabled and ready. His affairs were in order. The only thing holding him back was the weight of expectation, the knowledge that his departure would disappoint people who'd invested time and hope in his reintegration into their world. Still brooding by the window, I see. Isaiah turned to find Thomas in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the patient expression of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation for months. Not brooding, thinking about her. It wasn't a question. Thomas had learned about Bertha months ago, when Isaiah's obvious restlessness had finally prompted a frank conversation between the brothers about everything. Thomas handed him a cup and settled into the chair by the fireplace. You know, when I first heard about your mountain woman, I assumed she was some desperate creature who'd taken advantage of your isolation. The more you've told me about her, the more I've come to understand that it was quite the opposite. Isaiah joined his brother by the fire. She gave me the choice freely, never once tried to hold me here or make me feel guilty for considering it. That takes remarkable strength and remarkable love. Yes, it does. So why haven't you gone back to her? The question hung in the air between them. Isaiah had asked himself the same thing every day for the past month, and the answer was both simple and complicated. Because leaving feels like betraying everyone who welcomed me back. You, Catherine, Margaret, the business partners who've been patient with my distraction, the community that's embraced me again. Isaiah set down his coffee cup with careful precision, because choosing her means choosing a life that society will never approve of. And choosing to stay means choosing a life that you will never approve of, Thomas said gently. Brother, I've watched you for 11 months now. You've been kind, dutiful, everything a good son and brother should be. But you haven't been happy. Not once, not for a single day since you came down from that mountain. Isaiah started to protest, but Thomas held up a hand. I know happiness when I see it, because I found it with Catherine. The way your face changes when you talk about Bertha, that's what happiness looks like. The way you've been moving through life here like a man walking through fog, that's what duty without joy looks like. But what about the business? I've been running it successfully for years without you. The family? We survived your 3-year absence. We'll survive your choosing to live somewhere else. Margaret? She always loved her Uncle Isaiah, whether he lives in Denver or on a mountain. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. Isaiah, when Father was dying, do you know what he regretted most? Not the business opportunities he'd missed or the money he could have made. He regretted that his older son had never found the same kind of love he'd had with Mother. He died believing you were somewhere in the world, alone and unhappy, because he'd raised you to choose duty over joy. He said that. He made me promise that if I ever found you, I'd tell you that love, real love, The kind that makes you better than you thought you could be was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Thomas smiled sadly. I thought I could show you that by bringing you back into our world. But I think I've learned that your love is waiting for you in a place I can't go. Isaiah felt tears prick his eyes. All these months of wrestling with obligation and expectation, and his brother had understood from the beginning what mattered most. The decision, when it finally came, arrived with the clarity of mountain air after rain. Isaiah woke on a gray February morning, almost exactly 1 year since he'd left Bertha standing in their cabin, and knew with absolute certainty that he was done pretending he could build a life without her. He dressed quickly, pulling on traveling clothes instead of the fine suits he'd grown accustomed to wearing. The saddlebags went onto his shoulders, as if they'd been waiting there all along. In the mirror, he looked like himself again for the first time in months. Not the polished businessman Denver expected, but the man who'd learned to carve beauty from wood and find love in the most unlikely places. Thomas was waiting in the kitchen when Isaiah came downstairs, already dressed despite the early hour. On the table sat a small wooden box and a letter written in familiar handwriting. From her? Isaiah asked, his heart hammering. It came yesterday. I thought you might want to read it before you made your final decision. Thomas poured coffee for both of them, the domestic routine they'd established over the months of Isaiah's residence. Though I suspect your mind's already made up. Isaiah opened the letter with trembling fingers. Bertha's handwriting was as neat and precise as everything else about her, but he could see places where the ink had blotted, as if she'd paused in her writing to collect herself. My dear Isaiah, I hope this letter finds you well and happy in whatever life you've chosen to build. I'm writing because your year is nearly up, and I want you to know that whatever you decide, I understand and support your choice. The cabin has been good to me in your absence. I've kept everything exactly as you left it, though I've made some improvements I think you'd appreciate. The garden produced wonderfully last summer enough vegetables to trade in Georgetown for supplies, and still have plenty left over. Your ravens still visit every morning, though they seem as puzzled by your absence as I sometimes am. I've also been teaching some of the children in Georgetown to read and write during the winter months, which has given me purpose beyond simply waiting. It turns out I'm good with children, perhaps because I remember what it feels like to be judged for things you cannot change. There's talk of establishing a proper school, and they've asked if I would consider staying on as the teacher. I tell you this not to make you feel guilty if you choose to remain in Denver, but to let you know that I've built a life worth living regardless of what you decide. The woman who desperately needed your cabin for survival is gone. In her place is someone who could be happy anywhere, but who would be happiest sharing that life with you. The box contains something I made during the long evenings when missing you became almost unbearable. If you're reading this letter in Denver, preparing to write and tell me you've chosen to stay, please keep it as a memory of what we shared. If you're reading it in preparation to come home, and I hope with all my heart that you are, then consider it a promise of what we might still build together. I love you, Isaiah Fletcher. I loved you enough to let you go, and I love you enough to welcome you back without question or recrimination if that's what you choose. But if your heart has found another path, I will understand that too. Some gifts are meant to be temporary, and I will always be grateful for the time we had thought the choice is yours, as it should be. All my love, Bertha. Isaiah opened the wooden box with hands that shook. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, lay 2 wedding rings carved from gold, not the rough gold of a nugget, but proper gold that must have cost her dearly. They were simple, elegant, inscribed with their initials and a date. The date of her first arrival at his cabin, when their lives had changed forever. She had them made in Georgetown, Thomas said quietly. The jeweler there is a friend of mine. He said she brought in a gold locket, the only valuable thing she had left from her first marriage. and asked him to melt it down and create something new. Isaiah held the rings up to the light, marveling at their craftsmanship. Bertha had sacrificed her last connection to her previous life to create a symbol of the future they might still share. The gesture spoke of faith he wasn't sure he deserved and hope that humbled him completely. "She loves you," Thomas observed. "She does. And you love her more than my own life. Then what are you waiting for?" Isaiah closed the box and slipped it into his pocket, next to his heart. "I'm not waiting anymore." He embraced his brother at the front door, both of them emotional in the way of men who'd learned that time and distance could strengthen rather than weaken the bonds between them. "Come visit us," Isaiah said. "Bring Catherine and Margaret. The mountains are beautiful in summer, and I want Bertha to meet the family that raised me." "We will. And Isaiah? When you get there, when you see her again, don't waste time with apologies or explanations. Just tell her you're home." Isaiah mounted his horse as the sun began to rise over the Denver rooftops. The city was just awakening smoke rising from chimneys, early commuters beginning their daily routines, the familiar sounds of civilization starting another day. It was a good life for those who wanted it, but it wasn't his life anymore. His life was waiting in a cabin on a mountainside, where a remarkable woman was probably feeding chickens and wondering if today would be the day her love came home. Isaiah turned his horse toward the mountains and rode toward the only future that mattered. The cabin looked exactly the same and completely different all at once. As Isaiah crested the final ridge and saw their home nestled against the mountainside, he was struck by how small it appeared after a year of Denver's grand buildings, yet how perfectly it fit into the landscape, as if it had grown from the mountain stone itself rather than being built upon it. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line. The lean-to had been expanded and improved, and he could see additions to the garden plot that spoke of careful planning and hard work. Everything was neat, maintained, cared for with the same attention to detail that Bertha brought to all her endeavors. But it was the figure in the dooryard that made his heart stop. Bertha stood beside the well, drawing water for the evening chores, and the sight of her sent 11 months of careful composure crumbling away like ice in spring sunshine. She was exactly as he remembered, strong, practical, beautiful in the way that had nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with the light that seemed to emanate from within her. She looked up at the sound of his horse's hooves and went very still, the water bucket forgotten in her hands. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply stared at each other across the distance that separated them, a distance that was measured not just in yards, but in all the choices and experiences that had shaped the past year. Then Bertha set down the bucket with deliberate care and walked toward him, her step steady and sure. Isaiah dismounted, his own movements feeling clumsy and uncertain after months away from the mountain's rhythms. They stopped when they were close enough to touch, close enough to see the changes that time had wrought in each other's faces. Bertha looked older, more settled somehow, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter shared with the children she'd taught. Isaiah saw recognition in her gaze, but also assessment. She was reading him the way she'd always been able to, looking past his city clothes to the man beneath. "You came back," she said simply. "I came home," Isaiah replied, remembering Thomas's advice about explanations and apologies. "Are you staying?" Instead of answering with words, Isaiah pulled the wooden box from his pocket and opened it. The gold rings caught the late afternoon light, sending small rainbows dancing across their faces. Bertha's eyes widened, then filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "I had them made from my mother's locket," she whispered. "I know, they're perfect." Isaiah took out the smaller ring and held it up. "Bertha Hutchins, will you marry me? Not for practical reasons or winter survival, but because I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. Because a year in the world taught me that everything I want is right here with you. What about your family, your inheritance, the life you could have in Denver? My family will always be part of my life, but you are my life. The inheritance will help us build something beautiful here, maybe expand the cabin, improve the garden, even start that school you mentioned in your letter. As for the life I could have had, Isaiah smiled, cupping her face in his free hand. I already have the life I want. I just had to learn to choose it. Bertha's tears were flowing freely now, but her smile was radiant. Yes, Isaiah Fletcher, I will marry you and build a life with you and love you for whatever time we're given. He slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, marveling at how right it looked there, how perfectly it completed the picture of the woman who'd had the courage to propose to a hermit and the wisdom to set him free when he needed to find himself. I have something for you too, Bertha said, leading him toward the cabin. Several somethings, actually. Inside, their home was exactly as he'd left it, but warmed by small improvements, new curtains at the windows, additional shelves for their books, a larger table that could accommodate the guests she'd mentioned hosting during his absence. But what drew his attention was the cradle in the corner, finished and polished to a soft gleam, with a quilt draped across its edge. You completed it, Isaiah said, running his fingers along the smooth wood. With some help I learned to use your carving tools, not as skillfully as you, but adequately. Bertha moved to stand beside him, her hand coming to rest on the cradle's edge. I wanted it to be ready, in case we needed it sooner than expected. Something in her tone made Isaiah look at her more closely. There was a glow about her that he'd attributed to happiness at his return, but now he wondered if there might be another cause. Bertha, I'm with child, Isaiah. About 3 months along, I think, though it's hard to be certain. Her hand moved protectively to her still flat stomach. It happened just before you left. I wasn't sure at first, and then I didn't want to write and influence your decision. I wanted you to come back because you loved me, not because you felt obligated. Isaiah felt the world tilt around him as the full impact of her words sank in. A child. Their child, conceived in love and growing while he'd spent months questioning whether he deserved the happiness that had been offered to him. How do you feel? Are you well? I feel wonderful. Strong and healthy and more hopeful than I've been since you left. Bertha smiled at his obvious shock. Are you pleased? Instead of answering, Isaiah swept her into his arms, spinning her around the small cabin while she laughed with the pure joy of a woman whose greatest dreams were coming true. When he set her down, they were both breathless and grinning like children. Please doesn't begin to cover it, Isaiah said, kissing her soundly. Overjoyed, terrified, grateful beyond words. Good. Those are all the appropriate responses. As evening fell over their mountain home, Isaiah and Bertha sat together at their table, planning the future they would build together. A wedding ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who visited Georgetown monthly. Improvements to the cabin to accommodate their growing family. Letters to Thomas and Catherine, inviting them to visit and meet the woman who'd captured Isaiah's heart so completely. Outside, the March wind carried the scent of melting snow and new growth. Spring was coming to the mountains, bringing with it the promise of planting and growth and all the small miracles that made life worth living. But inside their cabin, spring had already arrived in the form of two people who'd found each other. Against all odds and chosen love over convenience, partnership over propriety, and hope over fear. They'd planted seeds that would grow into something beautiful, a family, a home, a legacy of choosing each other every day, despite what the world might think thought in the end. That was what mattered, not the opinions of others or the expectations of society, but the simple truth that some people are meant to find each other, and when they do, everything else is just details. Their love story had begun with a practical proposition, spoken by a desperate woman to a lonely man. It would continue with the everyday miracles of marriage, parenthood, and the quiet satisfaction of building something lasting together. And it would endure, as true partnerships do, through all the seasons yet to come.